In their typical manner, Soviet generals planned to complete this military special operation in a month at most. But as a result, the military campaign turned into a large and terrible war that lasted for 9 years. The Kremlin justified its invasion of a distant Asian country with loud phrases about international duty, support for social revolutions, and helping friendly people. But all the friendship and help came down to burned villages, looting, and mass destruction of civilians. As a result, the cruelty of some has given rise to even greater cruelty of others.
Если у нас этого не получится, нас самым дешевым образом порубят на куски и скормят собакам. А нашими головами будут играть в футбол.
On the scale of the war, for a long time the fire lit by Moscow was unknown, because newspapers and television were silent, and letters from soldiers were censored. Even sending photos to relatives was strictly forbidden.
Ніякої війни там немає, і все в нас добре, все було в секреті.
Society woke up only in the early 1990s, when lighted zinc coffins with young men, most of whom had recently graduated from school, began to arrive en masse in different parts of the USSR.
Этих куда? Донецк, Прибалтика, Подмосковье.
When they came home to look inside, even the parents were forbidden to advertise the funeral, and the tombstone was not allowed to indicate how and where the soldiers died. Friends, welcome to the Documentalist Project, and today we are talking about the war in Afghanistan in 1979, 20 years ago. Why did it start, and what were its consequences? How were thousands of Ukrainians forced to die for the interests of a foreign empire? And finally, we will talk about the parallels between the massacre in Afghanistan and the current Russian-Ukrainian war. Stay tuned, you will definitely be interested. On December 21, 1991, when the entire Western world was celebrating Christmas, the Soviet Union suddenly landed its troops in Afghanistan, at Kabul's Baroma and Kandahar airports. The decision to do so was made in top secret at a meeting of the Politburo of the CPSU Central Committee, and the main ideological inspirers of the armed invasion of the mountainous country were several people: KGB chief Yuri Andropov, Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. Of course, they all acted with tacit consent. At that time, the seriously ill General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev was already in the hospital. First of all, the Soviet Special Forces, which were GRU and KGB fighters, stormed the presidential palace of Hafiz and Amin. In this photo, you can see a group of Alpha Unit fighters who, together with others, were seizing the building. The palace was well fortified. In addition to armed guards, there were checkpoints and even armored vehicles around the building. So the battle lasted for a whole day. However, the forces were unequal. As a result, the president was shot, and his 2 young children and everyone else in the room were killed. The assassination of the Afghan leader was truly cruel and treacherous, because not long ago the main communist newspaper of the empire, however, called Amin a loyal friend of the USSR. 3 weeks before the attack on the palace, he received a congratulatory telegram from Brezhnev himself. And although Amin was Afghan, he always liked to say that he was more Soviet than all the other Soviet people. To confirm this, the Muslim allowed himself to drink alcohol twice a year, on May 9th and November 7th. But all the ideological loyalty to Moscow, as you can imagine, was in vain. By the way, here is an interesting fact that once again confirms the reputation of Russia. Before the armed attack, they tried to poison Amin and his family. At the banquet, the cooks, including KGB agents, put poison in the food. It was so powerful that the president and some guests fainted. They survived, but the food and juice were sent for examination, and all the kitchen workers were detained. In fact, this incident alerted Amin, and because of this, security around the palace was significantly tightened. And we continue. Thus, after the elimination of Hafiz Amin, power passed to Barak Kamal, a more obedient and predictable politician, on whom the Kremlin decided to place its bets. But instead of being stable and predictable, the situation in the country is becoming uncontrollable. The special operation turns into a huge bloody war even more.
March!
We will talk about the military massacre and how the events developed later, but to make the picture clearer, let us first explain what caused the attack on the presidential palace. because the change of power was not a spontaneous decision by Moscow, and it had been preparing for this step for a long time and carefully, in fact, for decades. The fact is that the Russians have been trying to establish a protectorate over Afghanistan since the 1990s, when the Bolsheviks came to power. In February 2011, the two countries signed a friendship treaty, under which the Kremlin paid millions in subsidies to the Afghans every year. The money was not spent in vain, because they saw this mountainous state as a possible road along which the world revolution would go on to India. We will not dive deep into that period. I will only say that for decades the communists supported a regime there that was favorable to them. To do this, they sent their agents, spies, and military advisors to Afghanistan. Depending on the need and the political situation, we also generously supplied weapons. Most of the Kremlin's efforts were directed at fighting the local resistance movement of the Mujahideen, who were guided by Islamic ideology. And of course, they did not want to accept Bolshevik ideas. The Soviets and the official Afghan authorities called the Mujahideen soul pans, that is, enemies or rebels or spirits. In the 1990s, a large group of Afghan army officers went to study at the Moscow Military Academy. Of course, there they were under the watchful eye of the communist secret services and returned home as convinced Marxists. Soviet curators oriented them to seize power for alleged socialist transformations. In addition to the military, the communists also involved university students who sincerely believed in the ideas imposed by the Kremlin in political provocations. Of course, this process was not a matter of one day, but already in the early 70s, there were several political groups of communists and Islamists in Afghanistan.
В Кабуле нам довелось видеть много демонстраций против империалистического вмешательства во внутренние дела демократического Афганистана. На этот раз в колоннах шли одни женщины. Они хотят мира, лучшей судьбы для своих детей. И дети этой страны могли бы быть счастливее, не будь этой необъявленной войны.
In 1978, the communists of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan were a Marxist political force. With the help of the special services, an anti-state armed coup is being carried out, similar to the one that Lenin carried out in the 17th century. The traditional form of government, the monarchy, was overthrown. Soviet officers with a communist ideology that was alien to the local population gained power in the state. They are launching radical social transformations, land reform, and much more, which has caused anger and resistance among Afghans. For example, the Kremlin's puppets began dekulakizing landowners, and, copying the USSR, they began to take land not only from large, but also from medium and small farms. The communists mercilessly eliminated Afghan patriarchal values and traditions, and even attempted to attack religion. When they were asked, "What about Islam?" they replied, "Come back in a year, and you will see that our mosques are empty."
Каждую пятницу, в выходной день, по решению городского комитета, партийные работники ведут в мечетях разговор с людьми о целях и задачах революционной власти. Непростое это дело молодому человеку беседовать с седобородыми старцами. На Востоке всегда почиталась мудрость пожилых, а мудрость Фарида Лали без седин. Позади у него, однако, 11 лет в партии, годы подпольной работы.
All these innovations were not to the liking of Afghans, and this was immediately taken advantage of by local Islamists, who declared themselves true defenders of Muslim values and went to war against the communists. A year later, in 1979, the Islamic opposition of Afghanistan launched an armed uprising against the government. President Amin Hafiz, whom we mentioned at the beginning, realizes that he cannot keep the situation under control and asks the Kremlin to send troops into the country. However, Moscow is expected to respond promptly to this proposal. This is not surprising, since the Cold War was ongoing, an ideological confrontation between the communist bloc and the countries of the Western world. And the Kremlin was interested in the existence of another regime in Central Asia that would be friendly to the USSR and hostile to the United States. At the same time, the Russians not only decided to deploy a military contingent, but also to eliminate the seemingly loyal Amin. Why? And all because they were not satisfied with his policy and did not fully trust him. They suspected that their protege was cooperating with the CIA, so The president of Afghanistan has been eliminated. One by one, the planes land at the airport. The military group that entered a foreign country was officially called a limited contingent of Soviet troops by Soviet propaganda and did not recognize until the very end that a full-scale and bloody war was going on in Afghanistan. The word war, as it is now, was banned altogether. It was officially called international aid or the fulfillment of international duty.
Служба советских парней на многострадальной афганской земле проникнута высокой идеей интернационального долга. Для них, как и для их отцов, не существует понятия «чужое горе». А что такое война, эти ребята знают уже не понаслышке. Потому и цена боевых наград особая.
When the whole world declared aggression, Soviet propaganda was indignant, saying that there was no aggression and no war. As I said, the Kremlin hoped that with all its power it would be able to seize and retain power in Afghanistan within a month. But he did not take into account the local specifics and scale of resistance. Nor did he expect that the Mujahideen would be actively supported by the United States, Britain, Iran, Egypt, Pakistan, through which American aid was being channeled, and other ideological opponents of the communists. Oddly enough, the Mujahideen were also fought with Soviet-style weapons that the United States and Saudi Arabia purchased from Arab countries, Egypt and Israel. In particular, Zbigniew Brzezinski recalled that secret purchases of Soviet weapons from communist Czechoslovakia were made for Afghan insurgents. That is, they were constantly receiving all the modern weapons that were available in the world at the time, including assault rifles, sniper rifles, anti-tank grenade launchers, and even air defense equipment. A good example of this is this photograph, in which one of the Mujahideen stands in the mountains with an American anti-aircraft missile system that was used to shoot down Soviet planes and helicopters. In addition, the Afghans knew the terrain very well and waged effective guerrilla warfare, not engaging in direct clashes, but rather arranging ambushes and sabotage, and then retreating to fortified areas in the mountains. All of this exhausted the Soviet army, so the generals had to send more and more military equipment and soldiers there. Eventually, the so-called limited contingent grew to 100,000 soldiers. And we continue. So, when the special operation to capture Afghanistan failed, and everything turned into a full-fledged war that required a large number of soldiers, the Kremlin boss had to explain this to his citizens somehow, and the official version sounded trite, simple, and predictable, preventing the threat of foreign interference. If it weren't for us, it would be America. We were a few hours ahead of them, and from there the damned Americans would have attacked the USSR. By the way, this opinion still exists among Russians to this day. They sincerely believe in it. I would add that Brezhnev really thought that Washington wanted to deploy medium-range missiles in Afghanistan that threatened Soviet territory. In fact, the United States had no such plans, and this is painfully reminiscent of the pretext for the military invasion of Ukraine. All these fictitious NATO bases that Putin is now manipulating. The war in Afghanistan was extremely brutal, and brutal on both sides. It was well described in her book Zinc Boys by the Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich, who back in the 80s conducted many interviews with participants who fought on the side of the USSR as infantrymen, nurses, artillerymen, and other fighters. When you read all these memoirs, you realize that people, on the one hand, went through real hell, and on the other hand, turned the lives of others into hell. Everything about these stories is striking, and I'll give you a few quotes. I shot, spared no one. He could have killed a child, because all the men, women, and old children fought with us there. The boy's sieve was turned into a roof. At that moment, our team was reduced to dust. In the hospital, I put a teddy bear on the bed of an Afghan boy. He took the toy with his teeth and played with it, smiling. He was missing both arms. "Your Russians were shooting," his mother translated to me, combing through the slag, usually by opening the door, and before entering, you throw a grenade so that you don't run into machine gun fire. Why risk it with a grenade? Later, I threw a grenade and went in. There are women, 2 old boys and 1 baby in a box instead of a stroller. I'm guessing now. We are waiting for the caravan in ambush. We lie in the sand for 2 or 3 days with an empty moon beneath us. At the end of the 3rd day, Satanev fires the first round of fire with such hatred when it's all over. It turned out to be a simple caravan. He left with bananas and jam for life. We ate a lot of sweets. Later, all those who returned from Afghanistan told me how, having taken a village, they threw grenades at the houses of the locals, even if there were women and children inside, and then broke in and examined whether there were any dead or armed men among them. How they raped and drowned local girls in wells. About mass looting, when everything that was in short supply in the Soviet Union was sent to the USSR. Commanders and soldiers, heroes and cowards were engaged in business. The dollar and water will always find their way everywhere. 3 soldiers' dreams: to buy a mother's shawl for a friend, a cosmetic set, and a pair of swimming trunks. Back then, there were no swimming trunks in the Union. This is what this war was like. I had to survive and bring back some things. A TV, a sheepskin coat, a cooler tape recorder. It's a joke that people learn about the war in the Union in thrift stores when they buy new goods. In winter, you drive around our Smolensk. Girls in Afghan fur coats are fashionable. In other words, it was a typical USSR war of aggression that had no justification other than geopolitical appetites. You will say that there were Ukrainians there, and you will be right. Yes, there were indeed many Ukrainians there. No one denies this. There is a statistic that 100,000 USSR citizens passed through Afghanistan during all the years of the war, and 160,000 Ukrainians were among them. It's very important. It should be understood that, ideologically believing the propaganda, only a few people went to Afghanistan. The bulk of those who fought there were conscripts, very young guys who had just recently finished school. They joined the army to defend their country, and in an instant they found themselves on the territory of a foreign country. However, no one asked them whether they wanted to go or not. The empire, like now, was implementing its aggressive plans. It needed fighters and blood, and no one was reckoned with.
Было мне 18 років. Нам сказали, що больные и дурные останутся в Союзе. Все остальные вы поедете туда. Как бы вы ни косили.
As a result, even the parents themselves often did not know where their children were. Most often, in order not to upset and frighten their families, the soldiers wrote that they were in Mongolia. I repeat once again, no one is diminishing or devaluing the courage of Afghans. But they themselves recognized that they were fighting in someone else's war and for someone else's values. To deceive the military, they were often fooled into believing that they were going to Afghanistan to help the Afghan people, build schools, or raise the economic level.
Этот объект – заметный шаг в развитии экономики Афганистана. Здесь у советских специалистов прошли и проходят выучку тысячи афганцев. Защита дипломов молодыми инженерами-строителями прямо на комбинате стала традицией. Законную гордость его многотысячного коллектива составляют собственные кадры дипломированных специалистов, прошедшие здесь трудовую закалку. Вот момент всеобщего праздника. Родился новый инженер-строитель.
The truth about the Afghan massacre in the USSR was concealed as best they could. It was not written about in the newspapers or talked about on the radio or television. Although the massacre on foreign territory claimed the lives of more than 10,000 soldiers, and this is only official data, there was no talk of casualties or the course of the fighting. They were carefully classified. For a long time, for example, there was a ban on public funerals for those killed in Afghanistan. The graves could not indicate the place of their death.
Первых погибших на афганской земле увозил белый тюльпан. Остальных увозил черный тюльпан. И еще неизвестно, кому повезло больше.
I was drafted in the 81st, said one of the soldiers. The war had been going on for 2 years, but little was known and spoken about it in citizenship. No one has ever seen a zinc coffin before. It was only later that we learned that the coffins had already been brought to the city, but were hidden in secret. At night, the tombstones said, died, instead of perished. But no one asked themselves why 20-year-old boys in the army suddenly started dying of vodka or flu. Their relatives cried, but the rest of us went on with our lives, and they did not care. This was confirmed by one of the nurses who was in Afghanistan. We couldn't write the truth even in funerals. A person was often left with half a bucket of meat, and we wrote that he died in a car accident, fell into an abyss, food poisoning. When there were thousands of them, we were allowed to tell our families the truth. A Boo Spogad grenade launcher, I was used to other people's deaths, and in fact, I was afraid of them. I saw how in 1 second nothing remained of a person, as if he had never been in an empty coffin. The uniforms sent to the homeland are filled with foreign soil to make them weigh the right amount. Why did Afghanistan have such a high number of victims? This eventually forced the USSR to end the war. This is because the local population, from young to old, hated the occupiers and wanted to destroy them by any means necessary.
Если для нормальной, в том числе и нашей, назовем так, общим планом европейской цивилизации, война – это всегда горе, это беда, это трагедия, это гибель, это смерть, это всегда беда. Вот. Для афганского народа война – это самое нормальное состояние.
In response to the presence of USSR troops and attempts to impose communism on the country, the Mujahideen also sent fighters with unprecedented cruelty. Their methods of fighting the enemy were reminiscent of the Middle Ages. For example, when Mujahideen were captured, they would cut off a fighter's limbs, tie them with a tourniquet so that the person would not die of blood loss, and leave him alone. Because of this, the greatest fear for Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and other nationalities who were part of the military contingent was to be captured. For the USSR, the Afghan war ended ingloriously. In May 1992, the withdrawal of troops began, and the last units of the 40th Army crossed the bridge of friendship between the Union and Afghanistan on February 22, 1991. The resistance of the local opposition was not overcome. The number of Mujahideen grew from year to year, even at the peak of the Soviet presence, and they controlled more than 70% of the country's territory. At the same time, the war led to a rapid deterioration of the Kremlin's relations with the West, a boycott of the 1992 Summer Olympics in Moscow, a new stage of the arms race and the Cold War, significant human and financial losses, which significantly accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. The consequences of the war were terrible. The fighting in Afghanistan has killed between 1 and 2 million people. Most of them were civilians. The scoop also paid a terrible price. As I said, 15,000 killed soldiers are only official figures, as unofficial statistics are said to be much higher. 3,000 Ukrainian soldiers and officers were killed. The vast majority of them were under 20. Thousands of Ukrainians were injured and returned home with disabilities. In addition, the war gave rise to the so-called Afghanistan syndrome. Even 10 years after the end of the massacre, 20% of Afghan veterans had a clinical variant of post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of them committed suicide, got drunk, and could not adapt to civilian peaceful life. If you want to feel the context of that time and all the hopelessness that awaited citizens in the Soviet Union, I recommend watching the film Cargo 200 by the cult Russian director Alexei Balabanov. The film is not for the faint of heart, but it reveals the depths of the Russian soul in the most truthful way possible. Friends, if you liked the story and watched it to the end, please subscribe to the channel. Perhaps there are former military personnel who fought in Afghanistan, or their relatives among the blog's viewers. Write in the comments what impressed you in this war, and what you remember the most.